The sound of amplifiers still lingers in memory, though the stage has long gone dark. Picture a winter street in London, damp with drizzle, where echoes of rock anthems trail behind like ghosts. Hours earlier, a voice had carried itself over crowds, a rasping snarl that could rattle pub windows and shake a stadium into frenzy. Now that voice was gone, and silence, heavier than thunder, pressed down on the night. It wasn't a crash that ended it, but a slip into stillness. And in that stillness, the world lost one of its rawest voices. Hold the motif in your hands. A battered microphone, its steel grill dented, the cable wound like a snake across beer-stained floorboards. That mic was passed night after night through sweat-fogged air, vibrating with the wild energy of Friday nights. You can almost smell the mix of stale lager and cigarette haze. Hear the scrape of boots on sticky pub floors. See the grin that dared you closer. It was more than equipment. It was a key to liberation. A promise that for 2 furious hours the outside world could not intrude. But to anchor this story, you have to start far from London's cold. Think of Western Australia, Fremantle's breeze, the hard sunlight glinting off car bonnets, and the endless road stretching away from Perth. A boy learnt to raise his voice above engines and backyard noise, shaping it into something uniquely Aussie. Part defiance, part celebration. You can almost hear the backyard radio on a veranda, a mother calling from the kitchen, neighbors laughing over the fence. That was the rhythm of a life that would soon leap from suburban noise to global roar. The stakes were never just about a band climbing charts. They were about identity, about proving that a scrappy pub band from Australia could roar as loudly as anyone on the planet. Bon Scott fronted AC/DC not as a polished figure, but as a raw spark, the embodiment of sweat, laughter, danger. Millions of records would sell, arenas would overflow, security would strain to hold back surging fans. Saturday night was no longer just a night out. It became a gospel of noise and nerve, carried in his unmistakable growl. And yet, within every scream of triumph, there was fragility. How do you keep the fire burning when you are the fire? How do you survive being the spark everyone else depends on? These questions hover like feedback at the edge of a song, which brings us here. How does a life built on sound and excess meet such a sudden, chilling quiet? What truly happened on that night in London when the music paused? Was it simply a tragic end to a long road, or is there still another verse hidden in the silence? The riff leads us backwards and forwards, from Perth's sunlight to London's drizzle, from applause to silence, in search of the man behind the grin, and the voice that still rattles the air long after the last chord faded. Picture the contrast more vividly. One night in Sydney, thousands crammed shoulder to shoulder, fists in the air, voices hoarse from chanting his name. Security guards struggled, fans fainted, and the roar seemed endless, unstoppable. And then, just months later, a London morning broke without that roar, leaving only drizzle on pavements and headlines that could never capture the full sound. The distance between those two moments, from a stadium's thunder to a quiet street, is the gap this story must cross. It is in that chasm that the legend of Bon Scott lives, suspended between noise and silence, light and shadow, forever asking us to listen closer to what remains. He was not just a singer, not just a frontman. To many, Bon Scott was the living embodiment of what rock and roll was meant to be. Wild, unpolished, and defiantly alive. He was called the larrikin poet, a rascal with a microphone who could turn a pub fight into a hymn and a stadium crowd into a congregation. His voice wasn't smooth, it was sandpaper and smoke. Yet that rasp carried a truth you could not ignore. Australia has given the world many performers, but Bon was different. He wasn't sculpted for fame. He wrestled it, laughed at it, wore it like a jacket that never quite fit but somehow became iconic. On stage, he strutted with that mischievous grin, chest bare, eyes glinting with challenge. Offstage, friends recalled a man who was restless, hungry for connection, and sometimes trapped by the very persona that had made him unforgettable. Fame gave him freedom, yet it also placed him inside a cage lined with expectation. There is always a contrast, glory and shadow, applause and silence. Bon Scott represented both at once. Millions of records sold, tours stretching from Melbourne to Madison Square Garden, AC/DC climbing charts and conquering continents. But between those triumphs were the nights of exhaustion, the quiet hours when the grin slipped, when the question hung heavy. Could a man live up to his own legend? Imagine the roar of 100,000 voices, and then imagine the sudden loneliness of a single hotel room. What made him so magnetic was not perfection, but contradiction. He was both poet and prankster, rebel and romantic. He could pen lyrics that winked with humor, yet cut with honesty. He could charm a room and then disappear into its shadows. Was it this duality that drew us closer? Knowing that behind the swagger there was a man who could just as easily have been one of us? Or was it that, in his flaws, we recognized our own? And so the questions linger. Did the same fire that lit the stage also burn away the quiet places of his life? Could anyone have carried the weight of being Bon Scott without stumbling? These questions are not accusations, but echoes. Echoes that carry from Perth to London, from the crackle of an ABC radio broadcast to the silence of a foggy street. His introduction is never complete without both halves, the laughter and the lament, the applause and the emptiness that followed it. As we step further into his story, we are not only tracing the arc of a rock icon, we are asking ourselves, what does it mean to live so loudly that the silence afterwards feels unbearable? What does it mean for a voice to stop when that voice has defined an era? The answers, if they exist, lie not only in the music he left behind, but in the spaces between. The pauses, the shadows, the questions we still ask. And that, perhaps, is why Bon Scott remains more than a memory. He remains a mystery wrapped in noise, laughter, and silence. Long before the chaos of world tours and the roar of stadium crowds, Bon was simply Ronald Belford Scott, a boy with restless eyes growing up under the Western Australian sun. Born in Scotland, his family migrated when he was just 6, trading the grey skies of Kirriamure for the blinding light of Fremantle. Imagine that shift. Cold cobblestone streets replaced by the hard brilliance of an Australian beach town, accents colliding in the schoolyard. A boy trying to find his footing in a new land. The motif begins here. The sound of a backyard radio, tinny and half-distorted, carrying Elvis and Little Richard across suburban fences. It was not polished music, but it was enough to spark something. Bon would tap rhythms on tabletops, drum on his knees, and test his voice against the squawk of magpies in the morning. His mother recalled him always humming, always restless. The neighbors heard it too. A raw energy that seemed too big for the boy who carried it. Was it destiny, or just a restless child looking for release? School halls could not contain him. Teachers labeled him unruly. Classmates found him magnetic. He joined the Fremantle Scots Pipe Band, learning discipline with bagpipes slung across his shoulders, the drone filling open air. That unlikely beginning, bagpipes and brass buttons, would later echo in his rock persona, blending tradition with rebellion. Even then, the grin was there, half defiant, half playful, as if he knew rules existed only to be bent. But life in Perth's working-class suburbs was not all sunlight. The family lived modestly, money was tight, and Bon often felt like an outsider, too rough for one circle, too wild for another. He drifted from odd jobs, apprentice, laborer, truck driver, yet nothing seemed to fit. What did fit was the stage, no matter how small. Pub bands, garage rehearsals, sweaty halls where feedback squealed and beer bottles clinked. These were his classrooms, and in each one, he learned a lesson no book could teach. That sound could be a weapon, and laughter could be armor. There were setbacks, early brushes with trouble, nights spent answering to authority, moments when it seemed he might never outrun his own restlessness. Friends remembered him as both loyal and reckless, a mate who could make you laugh even when the situation was dire. But beneath the bravado was a search for belonging, for a voice, for a place where he didn't have to apologize for being loud. And so, the boy who once marched in a pipe band, who once wrestled with schoolmasters and odd jobs, carried his restless energy into a new kind of stage. He would soon find the band that could match his fire, and the world that would never forget his name. But that was only the beginning. When Bon Scott stepped into AC/DC in 1974, something clicked that would alter the sound of rock forever. Imagine a fuse being lit, Angus and Malcolm Young tearing riffs from their guitars like sparks, and Bon, bare-chested, leather-clad, stepping to the microphone with that mischievous grin. The chemistry was instant. Pub stages turned electric, crowds swelling beyond capacity, security guards struggling to hold back the tide of bodies. In Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide, Perth, wherever they played, the roar was the same. It wasn't just music. It was a charge, a declaration, a gospel of noise. Shock numbers piled up quickly. High voltage sold in the hundreds of thousands at home, then millions abroad. Let There Be Rock became more than an album title. It became a prophecy. By the late 1970s, AC/DC had sold over 10 million records, climbing charts in Britain and America, breaking through barriers that few Australian acts had ever crossed. In 1979 alone, with Highway to Hell, they reached a new summit. Stadiums filled to the brim, fans fainting in the crush. Police escorts needed to funnel the band safely away. Each show felt like a battle, fought with amplifiers and sweat. The imagery was unforgettable. Angus in his schoolboy uniform duck-walking across the stage. Bon prowling, teasing, eyes glinting with danger. Together, they created a spectacle both theatrical and feral. Journalists described it as chaos barely held together by rhythm. But fans saw it differently. Liberation. Imagine being there, in a crowd of 50,000, your chest vibrating with bass, your voice breaking as you screamed the chorus. Was it simply a concert, or a rite of passage? ARIA charts, UK top 10s, Rolling Stone profiles. Accolades flowed, but for Bon it was never about trophies. The stage was his arena, his proof. Yet awards did come. Highway to Hell cracked the US Billboard Top 20, a feat that placed AC/DC alongside giants. Tours expanded, from Europe to America, where the band played sold-out nights at Madison Square Garden and California arenas. Australian pride swelled. ABC and SBS ran stories about the Aussie band conquering the world. From Perth pubs to global platforms, the transformation was staggering. But glory was not just numbers, it was the mania in the crowd. Fans collapsed in the heat of the front row, some carried out by medics, others clinging to barricades just for another glimpse. Security lines broke and Bond's grin only widened, daring them closer. He seemed indestructible. A rock poet who laughed at danger, who drank in chaos like oxygen. And yet, the brighter the light, the deeper the shadow. How long could a man keep feeding the furnace of that kind of fame? Even as AC/DC scaled peaks, questions hovered. Was Bond leading the charge, or was the charge consuming him? Could anyone live at that volume forever? For now, the world saw only triumph. Gold records on walls, magazines calling him the wildest frontman alive, and fans screaming his lyrics back at him with religious fervor. The gospel of AC/DC was spreading faster than anyone could have imagined. And then came 1979. Highway to Hell climbing charts across the globe, catapulting them into superstardom. It was their breakthrough, their passport to immortality. But beneath the thunderous riffs, there were hints of fragility. Bond's voice, so strong and reckless, sometimes cracked under strain. His grin, so wide and defiant, occasionally flickered with something else. Was it exhaustion? Was it a man beginning to feel the weight of carrying chaos on his shoulders? The triumph was real. Millions of albums, sold-out arenas, headlines hailing them as saviors of rock. But triumph has a price. And soon, the darker verses of Bon Scott's life would begin to surface. Verses that no chart position could erase. Behind the roar of amplifiers and the glare of stage lights, there was another rhythm. Slower, heavier, and far less forgiving. Friends recalled that Bon, for all his swagger, wrestled with sleepless nights. Tours were endless marathons. Flights, interviews, performances, after-parties that never seemed to end. In public, he laughed, joked, and teased. But in quieter hours, he confessed to feeling trapped in a cycle that demanded more noise, more energy, more spectacle. How long can any man live as both fuel and flame? Some reports suggested he was caught between the joy of performance and the toll it took on his body. The long nights, the unhealthy habits, the relentless expectation that he must always be the wildest figure in the room. Others disputed the severity, pointing instead to his resilience, his ability to stride on stage night after night as though nothing could touch him. But those who knew him best sensed the cracks. A grin can be a facade, a mask that conceals exhaustion. Was the joke on the world or on himself? Bon often spoke of freedom, yet fame narrowed his choices. Every gig demanded the same fire. Every crowd expected the same grin. Offstage, he drifted. Sometimes restless, sometimes reckless. Friends described moments when his laughter dimmed, when the energy drained and silence replaced it. The man who could electrify 50,000 people struggled to find peace in his own company. In pubs across London and Sydney, he was both adored and pursued. Fans clung to him. Strangers projected myths onto him. Who was left beneath the legend? Touring America in the late 70s only deepened the challenge. The band's success soared, yet the pace was brutal. Reports spoke of grueling schedules, dozens of shows in as many weeks. Miles of highway blurred into a haze. In interviews, Bon joked about being married to the road. But there was an undertone, a hint that he longed for something steadier, something quieter. Could he ever have it while being Bon Scott? Rumors circulated, as rumors always do. Some whispered about tensions within the band, others about personal struggles that trailed him like shadows. Nothing was ever fully clear, and perhaps that was part of his mystique. He was open yet elusive, laughing yet unreadable. To the world, he was invincible. To those closer, he was a man battling to keep balance on a tightrope stretched too thin. And so the contrast sharpened. On one side, the screaming crowds, the gold records, the chaos that made him immortal. On the other, the weight of expectation, the fatigue that no encore could mask. The brighter the light, the deeper the shadow. And Bon Scott was standing in both at once. What happens when the mask slips? When the laughter fades? When the spark begins to flicker? The answer would come not on stage, but in a London night that began like many others, and ended with a silence no one expected. The London winter of February 1980 carried a damp chill, the kind that seeps into stone and bone. Streets glistened under street lamps, slick with drizzle, while the city's nightlife pulsed in hidden corners. Bon Scott had always thrived in such places, pubs alive with music, friends spilling laughter into the night. That evening seemed ordinary, almost routine. Drinks with mates, the familiar haze of conversation, the sense that tomorrow would bring another rehearsal, another plan for AC/DC's rising star. But somewhere between laughter and departure, the routine fractured. Imagine the soundscape. Doors creaking, car engines coughing in the cold, muffled music leaking from late-night bars. Bon's voice, once capable of cutting through stadium thunder, was softer now, almost lost amid the hum of London's nocturnal life. He slid into the passenger seat of a friend's car, the night wrapping around him like a heavy coat. Streetlights flickered across his face, illuminating that familiar grin. But behind it was fatigue, weeks of late nights and restless days pressing down. The hours blurred. By dawn, frost etched the car windows, muffling the city's awakening. Inside, silence reigned. Bon did not stir. The man who had roared his way through thousands of nights was now still, his breath absent, his body slumped against the seat. The microphone that had once seemed an extension of his hand was far away, mute. The transition was jarring, from the chaos of applause to a quiet more absolute than any encore. The motif returns, that battered microphone, lying unused, silent as the city moved on without its owner. For years it had carried sweat and sound. It had borne witness to triumph. Now it was an object in waiting, an emblem of absence. Bon's tragic end was discovered not on stage, but in the stillness of a parked car, in a city that barely noticed one more vehicle by the curb. The headlines would come later, blazing across newspapers. But in that frozen hour, it was only silence, heavy and final. What struck those who later learned the news was how ordinary the scene had been. No stage lights, no screaming fans, no soaring riffs. Just London drizzle, frost on glass, and a voice forever stilled. Could anyone have imagined that the man who had just delivered Highway to Hell, an anthem of defiance, would find his journey ending in such quiet? Was it fate or the unavoidable cost of living so furiously, so unrelentingly alive? Thus, Bon Scott's last night became more than an ending. It became a mirror, reflecting the fragility behind the fire. A man celebrated for his roar met his silence not with spectacle, but with the ordinary hum of a city asleep. And yet, in that silence, something else stirred. The beginning of a myth, the shaping of a legacy that would outlive the man himself. The official story was stark in its simplicity. According to London police at the time, Bon Scott's death was ruled a tragic end after a night of heavy drinking. There were no dramatic conspiracies in the initial reports. No hidden villains. Just a man who had lived loudly, caught in the vulnerability of exhaustion and excess. The coroner's notes suggested misadventure, an accidental outcome of habits long tied to rock and roll. For some, this explanation was enough, but for others, it felt too plain, too ordinary for a figure who had lived so furiously. Media outlets seized the ambiguity. Newspapers in Australia splashed his photo across front pages. AC/DC frontman found dead in London car. British tabloids offered lurid headlines, hinting at darker truths, painting him as both hero and cautionary tale. Friends, meanwhile, were quick to defend him. They insisted that Bon was not reckless beyond reason, that he was looking ahead, excited about the band's next album sessions. Could a man so full of plans simply vanish into silence overnight? Some reports suggested there were inconsistencies, that details of the night were hazy, that timelines did not quite match. Stories surfaced of him moving from bar to bar, companions shifting, memory blurred by drink. Others disputed these accounts, arguing that myths had grown in the gaps left by grief. The truth, they said, was more mundane. A night out gone wrong, with no hidden hand at play. But the very vagueness of those hours kept the mystery alive. Rumors multiplied. One theory painted his death as the inevitable crash of a life lived too hard, too fast. Another whispered of medical vulnerabilities overlooked, questions about whether he had sought help in time. Still others murmured about the pressures of fame, the weight of being Bon Scott, the exhaustion that no encore could mask. None of these theories were ever confirmed, yet each carried its own shadow, feeding into the mythology. The showdown, then, lies between two versions of Bon's final night. On one side, the official explanation, a tragic accident born of overindulgence. On the other, the enduring suspicion that something deeper, more complicated may have unfolded in those final hours. Which is closer to the truth? Perhaps both, perhaps neither. What remains certain is that his passing left AC/DC and the world standing at a crossroads, uncertain of how to continue without him. And so the question lingers still. Was Bon Scott's death simply the end of a relentless lifestyle? Or was it a silence that holds secrets we may never fully uncover? The mystery loop remains open, leading us not only into speculation, but into the legacy he left behind. For in the end, theories fade, but the echo of his voice, raw, unapologetic, unforgettable, continues to shake the air long after the questions grow quiet. News of Bon Scott's passing traveled faster than any riff. In Perth, radios broke the silence with bulletins that felt like hammer blows. On ABC and commercial stations alike, announcers paused before saying the words, as if they carried too much weight. Across Australia, fans pulled over on highways, stunned into stillness. Around the world, headlines mourned. Voice of AC/DC dies in London. For a band on the edge of global domination, the loss seemed not just personal but seismic. His funeral in Fremantle drew thousands. Friends, bandmates, family, and fans crowded the streets, lining the route to the cemetery. Some wore black, others denim and leather. Still others carried flowers and scrawled lyrics. The service was solemn yet raw, punctuated by the sound of weeping, the shuffle of boots, and the occasional cheer when his name was spoken. In the distance, motorcycles revved their engines, a fitting salute for a man who had lived with throttle wide open. Fremantle Cemetery became both resting place and pilgrimage site, where fans still leave bottles, lyrics, and tokens. Back in the wider world, AC/DC faced an impossible decision: end the band or continue without the voice that had defined them. Within weeks, they resolved to go on, and the result was Back in Black. Recorded with new singer Brian Johnson, it sold over 50 million copies worldwide, becoming one of the most successful albums in history. Yet every chord of that record was steeped in grief, every lyric a monument to Bon. The black cover was not just aesthetic, it was mourning, solidarity, and legacy all in one. Tributes flowed across decades. Statues rose in Fremantle, in Kirriemuir, in Melbourne. Annual memorial gigs brought generations together, teenagers screaming alongside old roadies who had seen the band's earliest days. His influence extended beyond AC/DC, seeping into countless bands who tried to capture a fraction of his feral charisma. Even today, when a singer growls into a mic with a grin that's half dare, half welcome, you can trace the lineage back to Bon. The motif returns, applause fading into silence. In Bon's case, the silence never lasted. Fans still chant his name at concerts, still raise glasses in his honor, still argue over which of his songs captured him best. Was it the defiance of Highway to Hell? The cheek of Whole Lotta Rosie? Or was it simply his presence, unpredictable, unstoppable, unforgettable? Where were you when you first heard the news? That question lingers for those who lived through it. And for those born later, the memory is inherited. Stories passed down, records spun, YouTube clips replayed late at night. Bon Scott became not just a singer but a marker in time, a reminder of how fragile brilliance can be. His legacy is not only the music, but the way he embodied freedom. Reckless, joyous, flawed, and unforgettable. From the moment the amplifiers first roared to the silence of that London street, Bon Scott's story has been one of contrasts. Applause turned to quiet. Light turned to shadow. Noise turned to stillness. And yet, in that silence, his echo has never faded. Fremantle's breeze still carries his name. Radios still crackle with his rasp. And every stadium chant of AC/DC bears his imprint. The mystery loop closes where it began. A battered microphone, once warm in his grip, now rests as an emblem in museums and on memorials. The object reminds us that voices are not only sound but spirit, and that even when silenced, some spirits linger louder than ever. Bon's story was not about perfection, but about living without filter. A larrikin who turned chaos into chorus, who sang with the raw honesty of a man who knew both joy and fragility. So we ask, what does it mean to live so fiercely that even your silence reverberates decades later? Was his final night in London an ending, or simply the beginning of a legend? The questions may never resolve, but perhaps that is the point. Mysteries keep memories alive, and Bonds remains one of the loudest. Now it is your turn. Share your memories, your songs, your moments of Bon Scott. Where were you when you first heard his voice, or when the news reached you? His story is stitched not only into records and headlines, but into the lives of those who felt the thunder of his growl. In the end, Bon Scott's life is not measured by the silence of his final moment, but by the way his voice still rattles the air, daring us to sing louder. Live harder, and never forget the spark that once turned noise into legend.